Hi guys, welcome again to my channel. In this video I am going to discuss about S3 bucket policies and user policies. Bucket policies and user policies are the two access policy options available for granting permissions to your S3 resources. We will see what is the meaning of these policies and the use cases where we can use bucket policy and where to use user policy. I will also show you a demo on this. So watch the video till the end to understand it properly. So let's get started. So first of all, let us understand what is a policy. A policy is a JSON document that defines the permissions and access controls for AWS resources. Policies are used to specify who or what principals can perform actions such as read, write, or modify on specific AWS resources. Bucket policies and user policies are used to grant or deny permissions to your S3 resources. So let us see how a policy looks like and what are the important elements of a policy. So a policy looks like this, where we have some important components like effect, principal, action, and resource. So in the resource we provide the ARN of the resource. In our case, in case of S3, here we will provide the ARN of the S3 bucket or objects that the policy applies to. So this policy will apply to these resources: example bucket, AWS example bucket. And then next is action. Action are the operations that are allowed or denied. So these are the actions: get object, get bucket location, list bucket on this resource. And principal is the account or user who is allowed access to the actions and resources. Is allowed access or denied access will depend on the effect. Effect could be allow or denied. So in this policy, in this example, the user Dave, which is principal Dave, in this account 123, this account is allowed these actions: get object, get bucket location, and list bucket for this resource, which is our S3 bucket. So this is how a policy looks like. IAM policy and bucket policy both will be in this JSON format, will look like this. So I have also made a separate video on IAM policies, how to read, write IAM policies with a lot of examples. You can go through that video. I will provide a link here at the top right corner and in the description box as well. So let us now understand the difference between S3 bucket policies versus IAM policy, which is also referred to as user policies in the documentation. So to manage access to our S3 buckets and objects, these are the two methods. Either we can use IAM policies or we can use bucket policies. So the question is, what is the difference between these two? So let us understand the difference. Suppose this is our S3 bucket, this example bucket, and this is our IAM user Dave, and he wants to access S3 bucket and its objects. So there are two ways in which we can allow him permission to access our bucket. First method is using an IAM policy. We can create an IAM policy, and in the policy we will write the statements to allow S3 operations on the objects in the S3 bucket named example bucket, and we can attach this policy, IAM policy, with our principal, which is the user IAM user Dave. So in this way, by attaching IAM policy, we can allow the user access to this S3 bucket. And then another way is we can create a bucket policy, and in this policy we will allow S3 operations on the objects in S3 bucket named example bucket, and we can attach this with the S3 bucket. So this is the difference. We can see in case of bucket policy, we attach the policy to the resource, which is our S3 bucket, and in case of IAM policy, we attach the policy to the IAM principal which can be user, group or role. In our case it is an IAM user. Whereas, and one more thing, this IAM policy is known as identity based policy because IAM policy is attached to an identity which can be a user, role or a group. And bucket policy is known as resource based policy because it is attached to a resource. For example, S3 bucket in our example. So in this way, these are the two methods which we can use to allow access to this S3 bucket. Also, these two policies like IAM policy and bucket policy, we can also combine these policies like for more granular control. We'll see it later on how we can do it. So now this is an example sample IAM policy, how the policy looks like. So in this policy we have the effect is allow on resource this example bucket and the action is S3 star. This policy grants the IAM principal is it attached to permission to perform S3 operations on the contents of the bucket named example bucket. So here we have not provided any principal, like we have not given to which user we will attach this policy because the IAM principal in case of the IAM policy it is implied. The principal or the identity to which we will attach this policy will be the principal and it is implied. Implied means whoever the principal is whom this policy is attached will be able to will be given the permissions specified in this policy. And this is a sample S3 bucket policy. So in bucket policy we provide the effect allow and the principal is our user dev. Action will be S3 list bucket, resources are our S3 bucket. So this bucket policy enables IAM user dev in the account this to use the Amazon S3 list object operation in the example bucket. So there is one thing to note here. In the S3 bucket policy, the policy includes the principal element, whereas in the IAM policy, principal is not required because in IAM policies the principal is by default the entity to which the policy is attached. So we can apply both the bucket policy and IAM policy with the final authorization to the resource being the union of the both. But note that if there is an explicit deny anywhere, the overall result will be deny. Suppose we have attached both the IAM policy and the bucket policy to for user dev, and in the IAM policy we specified that we allowed access to the S3 bucket, but in the bucket policy we denied access to the user. So overall the result will be deny. We will see this in a demo later on in this video. So now let us see when to use IAM policy versus bucket policy. So IAM policy should be used when you need to control other AWS services other than S3. You can manage the access in one policy for all the resources instead of creating separate S3 bucket policy. Or you have a lot of S3 buckets, you can manage access to all the buckets in one policy instead of configuring separate bucket policy for each bucket. You prefer to keep and manage access control policies from a central place, which is the IAM service. And we can use S3 bucket policies. In these cases, bucket policies are often used for cross-account access, allowing other AWS accounts or specific IAM roles in other accounts to access objects in the bucket. You want to restrict the bucket to be accessed from specific IP addresses or VPCs. Bucket policy supports size of up to 20 KB, whereas IAM policies have size limit of up to 2 KB for users, 5 KB for groups and 10 KB for roles. So if your bucket policy has a limit, it is larger than this for user, groups and roles, then you can use the bucket policy, which allows for 20 KB size. So in nutshell, IAM policies will be simpler to manage since you don't have to define a large number of S3 bucket policies and can instead refer on fewer, more detailed IAM policies. IAM policies are not specific to S3 but can be used to grant or restrict access to any AWS services including S3, whereas S3 bucket policies are applied directly to S3 buckets and are used to manage access to objects within the bucket. We will understand this with a demo. So let us now see a demo. Let me open my AWS console. So I am in my S3 console now and I have this bucket. So let us first understand the IAM policy example. So in this diagram that we saw, we will create IAM policy which will allow access to the S3 bucket to our user Dave. So first we will see IAM policy example. So go to IAM, create a new user. Let us, the name of our user is Dave, and we are not going to attach a policy now. Now we will create a access key for this user. Create access key. I created this access key to show you how we will access the S3 bucket from AWS CLI. So let me open my command prompt and we will configure access keys for this user. Profile name Dave, access key, secret access key. I will delete these keys later on. So now we have configured our user. So let us see if he is able to list objects in S3 or not. So we got the error access denied list bucket operation because we have not given any permissions to this user. So let us now create an IAM policy for this user. Create inline policy for S3 and we want list bucket for a specific bucket. Add the ARN of the bucket. So go to bucket, copy ARN, paste it here, and next let us say S3 list bucket, create policy. So now we have attached this permission to our user Dave. Now let us see if he is able to access or not. Okay, we got the error again, list bucket operation, because the user Dave is trying to list all the buckets in S3 and we have only allowed him to list a particular bucket. So we need to provide the particular bucket URI. What is our bucket name? Test bucket AWS tutorials. Okay, S3. So we can see using this IAM policy, our principal, that is user Dave, is able to list the object inside this particular bucket. So in this example, what we did, we created an IAM policy, and using the IAM policy, we were able to list the bucket objects. Our user is able to list the bucket object. So what we did here, we created this IAM policy and attached the policy to IAM user, and using that policy he was able to access a particular bucket objects in S3. So now let me delete this policy and we will see the example of S3 bucket policy now. So for bucket policy, let us go to the S3 bucket and S3 bucket permissions. In the permissions we have this bucket policy section where we can create our bucket policy. So let us edit. We can write the bucket policy directly here, or we can use this policy generator, which is a very good tool. We will use this policy generator here. So select the policy type. Policy type will be S3 bucket policy. Principal will be our user. So copy the ARN of this user, paste here, and select the actions. The action we want to select is list bucket. List bucket ARN. Here we need to give the ARN of our bucket. Go to properties, copy this ARN, paste here, and add statement, generate policy. So this policy is generated by this policy generator. Go to S3 permissions, bucket policy, and paste here. So in this policy what we have done, these are the actions. S3 list bucket are allowed on this resource, which is our bucket name, bucket ARN, and the principal is this user Dave. So user Dave is allowed to list bucket for this bucket. Save changes. Now we created this bucket policy for our bucket, which is our resource based policy, which allows the user to list the objects in this bucket. So let us try this now. So we can see now the user is able to access, list the objects inside this bucket using the bucket policy. So what we did just now, we removed this IAM policy and now we created a bucket policy and bucket policy for our S3 bucket, and using that policy IAM user Dave is allowed to list the objects in this bucket. So this was an example where we created the bucket policy to list all the objects. We can also this bucket policy can also have certain conditions, like suppose we want to allow only access to a particular folder. Suppose for our example we want to allow access to this folder only. So what we can do, we can modify this policy. This is another example I would like to show. So remove this and we will generate a new policy now, in which we will allow access to only a particular folder. So what we want to do, we want to allow this principal Dave he is allowed to list the bucket for this bucket ARN. Now we want to allow access to only a particular prefix, which is our folder, new folder. So we need to add a condition here, where condition would be string like and the value would be test folder star. Add condition and add statement. So this statement allows the user Dave to list bucket AWS tutorials and only the folder inside this bucket. Now we need to add another statement where we will have to allow access to the objects inside this folder. So for this principal Dave, we want to allow get object inside that particular folder. Get object, and inside this bucket add statement, and then generate policy. Go to permissions, bucket policy, edit. So through this resource policy we are allowing access to only a particular folder. So what is this warning we are getting? Let us see. Use the operator type date instead of operator string. Current time. Okay, there is something wrong here. We don't want this current time. It was actually S3 prefix. We selected the wrong thing here. S3 prefix should be this. Save changes. Now let us see what our user is able to access. Let me run the same command again. So now the user is not able to list objects inside this bucket. Now we have allowed access to only a particular prefix, which is test folder. List objects access denied, still access denied. So let's see what is the mistake here. AWS S3 ls test bucket / test folder / so we can see the user Dave is not able to access the objects inside a particular folder. So in this way we can include conditions in our policy as per our requirement. So you can add conditions like this for various scenarios. Here in the AWS documentation they have given some bucket policy examples where you can see various examples like this policy requires every object that is returned to the bucket to be encrypted with server-side encryption. So here you can see a condition is applied if this S3 server-side encryption is true, and similarly you can see other examples granting permission to multiple accounts to upload objects or set object ACL for public access. So you can see you can tailor your policy based on your requirements using conditions in the policy. So in this way we saw these two examples, when to use and how to use IAM policy versus S3 bucket policy. So I hope I was able to explain these concepts. So if you like the video, please hit the like button and leave your comments and feedback. And if you have not already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thank you.